But these three men, they didn't look like they were here for a quiet fishing trip. They strode in like they owned the place, shoulders back, eyes scanning every display as if appraising real estate. Money, I thought, before I even registered the expensive outdoor gear clinging to their frames. The first one through was a tall Texan, a Stetson as wide as a dinner plate shadowing a face that looked carved from granite. His polished cowboy boots clicked against my old wooden floor, a sound that grated in the quiet shop. Caleb Vance, his drawl was thick as molasses. "That's me," I said, setting down a box of hatchets and wiping my hands on my jeans. "You the group that called about an unconventional expedition?" He extended a hand, his grip like iron. "Silas Thorne, everyone calls me Silas." He looked like he'd bought half of Texas and was planning on buying the other half. Behind him, a man with a smile that was too wide, too fixed, stepped forward. It wasn't the kind of grin you'd see on a friendly face. It was more like something a taxidermist might stitch onto a dead animal. His eyes, though, they darted around, taking everything in with an unsettling intensity. "Julian Croft," the grinning man said, his voice unnervingly cheerful. "Friends call me Julian." The third man was smaller, leaner, with hands that looked like they'd seen actual work, unlike Silas's manicured grip. His skin was tanned, his posture alert. "Marcus Blackwood," he said, his accent as thick as a eucalyptus grove. "Most folks just say Aussie." I shook each of their hands, noting their expensive watches, the way they held themselves. Rich hunters weren't unusual in Thunder Bay. We got plenty of them looking to bag a big moose or a bear in the Ontario wilderness. But something about these three felt different. Off. "So, what exactly are you looking to hunt?" I asked, leading them toward the back where I kept the detailed topographical maps. Silas and Marcus exchanged a look, while Julian's smile somehow stretched even wider. The silence stretched long enough to make my skin prickle, before Silas reached into his expensive jacket and pulled out a manila folder, thick with papers. "This might sound a little unconventional," he said, placing the folder on my worn counter. I opened it and immediately wished I hadn't. Newspaper clippings about missing hikers covered the top of the stack. Headlines from the Thunder Bay Chronicle-Journal and smaller regional papers going back decades. "Experienced camper vanishes without trace. Search called off for missing family. Hunter's remains found after 2 years." But there was something about them that made the hair on my arms stand up. "We're not after deer or moose," Marcus said, his voice flat, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "We're after bigger game." I looked through more papers, testimonials from other guides, most of whom I recognized. Men who'd spent their whole lives in these woods describing things they'd seen but couldn't explain. Tracks too large for any known animal, sounds that didn't belong to any creature in field guides, the smell of rotting meat where no carcass could be found. "You want to hunt a Wendigo?" The words came out flat, no question in my voice. Julian let out a low giggle that made my teeth ache. "Smart man," my grandmother's voice rang in my head. Stories she'd learned from the Anishinaabe elders about the cannibalistic spirit that stalked the northern forests. Warnings passed down through generations about the hunger that could never be satisfied, the cold that burned like fire. Those weren't fairy tales to scare children. They were warnings to keep people alive. "The Wendigo isn't a trophy animal," I said, closing the folder and pushing it back across the counter. "It's not something you hunt." Silas pulled out his wallet and counted out a wad of bills, more cash than I usually saw in a month. "We've done our research, Caleb. We know what we're asking." "No, you don't." I stared at the money but didn't touch it. I grew up hearing these stories from people who knew better than to go looking for trouble in the deep woods. "The Wendigo isn't just some local legend. It's a creature," Marcus interrupted, "with weaknesses we can exploit. We've hunted Cape buffalo in Zimbabwe, brown bears in Kamchatka, saltwater crocodiles in Queensland. This is just another predator." The casual way he said it made my stomach turn. These men saw everything as something to kill, mount, and display. They had no understanding of what they were asking me to help them find. Julian leaned forward, his smile never wavering. "We're willing to pay triple your usual rate." Triple. That was serious money. Enough to cover my truck payments for the rest of the year and then some. I had bills piling up in the off-season. Approaching winter was always lean for wilderness guides. And this job, it would carry me through until spring bookings picked up again. But taking city hunters after a Wendigo felt like leading them to their deaths. Worse, it felt like disrespecting everything my grandmother had taught me about the old ways and the things that lived in the wild. "Where exactly do you want to go?" I heard myself asking. Silas smiled and pulled out a GPS unit with waypoints already marked. North of Lake Superior, past where the logging roads end, we need somewhere remote enough that we won't be interrupted. I looked at the coordinates. I knew the area, even though it was so far out. Dense forest broken by marshland and rocky spots. Places where the trees were so thick you could walk 20 feet from a road and disappear completely. No cell towers, no rescue helicopters, no backup if things went wrong. That's Wendigo country, I said, handing back the GPS. Exactly. Julian's giggle rose in pitch. The money sat on the counter between us. I knew I should walk away, tell them to find another guide, or better yet, go home to Texas and Australia and forget about hunting legends. But my bank account was nearly empty, and winter was coming whether I liked it or not. We leave at dawn, I said, picking up the cash. 1 week, no extensions, and if I say we're turning back, we turn back. No arguments. Silas nodded and shook my hand again. Pleasure doing business with you, Caleb. As they went toward the door, Julian turned back with that horrible smile still on his face. This is going to be fun. The bell rang as they left, and I stood alone in my shop, surrounded by the normal tools of wilderness survival: compasses, maps, first aid supplies. Things that worked in the rational world, where predators followed biological rules and dangerous situations had logical solutions. I locked the folder in my desk drawer and tried not to think about what I'd just agreed to do. I held the steering wheel too tight as we left Thunder Bay, the trailer full of their gear bouncing behind us on the bad highway. 6 hours of driving stretched ahead, and I was already second-guessing my decision to take their money. Silas sat in the passenger seat, constantly fixing the GPS unit on my dashboard and making notes in a leather journal. In the backseat, Julian and Marcus spread topographical maps across their laps, marking coordinates with red pens and discussing approach routes. "You ever hunt anything that fights back, Caleb?" Marcus asked, looking up from his maps. "Bears mostly, moose during rutting season." I kept my eyes on the road, watching the landscape change from settled farmland to increasingly dense forest. Nothing that goes looking for trouble the way you're describing. Silas laughed and slapped my shoulder. "That's the difference between hunting and pest control. Real hunting means the animal has a fair chance of winning, more than fair in some cases." Julian's voice carried that same unsettling cheerfulness from the shop. "In Kamchatka, I tracked a brown bear for 3 days through terrain so rough it nearly killed me twice. When I finally cornered the beast, it stood up on its hind legs and looked me right in the eye. 9 feet tall, easy. Paws the size of dinner plates. What happened?" I found myself asking, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Julian's grin stretched wider in the rearview mirror. I put a .375H, an H round right through its heart. It dropped immediately. But for about 10 seconds before I pulled that trigger, I wasn't sure which one of us was the hunter and which was the prey. Marcus nodded appreciatively. Had a similar experience with a saltwater crocodile near Darwin. 20-footer that had been taking cattle from a station up there. Spent 2 weeks in a blind waiting for the perfect shot. When it finally surfaced, those eyes looked very old, intelligent. Like it knew exactly what I was planning. "And you killed it anyway," I said. "Of course I did. That's what separates us from the prey animals, mate. We don't back down when something dangerous looks us in the eye." Silas pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos, angling the screen so I could see while keeping one eye on the road. Images of him posing with various dead animals filled the screen. A Cape buffalo with massive horns, a leopard draped over his shoulders, an elephant that looked impossibly large even in death. "This beauty gave me the fight of my life," he said, stopping on a photo of himself crouched next to a massive buffalo. "Charged me from 50 yards out. Had to wait until it was close enough to count its eyelashes before I could guarantee a clean shot to the brain. One mistake and it would have trampled me into paste." The casual way they discussed killing these animals made my stomach twist. These weren't subsistence hunters taking what they needed to survive. They were wealthy men who traveled the world looking for things to kill and put trophies in their game rooms back home. We stopped for gas in Marathon, a small town that marked our transition from paved highways to logging roads. While I filled the tank, the 3 men stretched their legs and checked their weapons. Silas had brought a military-style rifle with a huge scope. Marcus carried a traditional hunting rifle with engravings on the barrel. Julian surprised me the most with his high-tech crossbow made of carbon fiber. "Figured you'd want something with more stopping power," I said, nodding toward the crossbow. Julian's fingers traced the weapon's frame with disturbing tenderness. Sometimes the old ways work best. Plus, it's quiet. Don't want to scare our target away with gunshots. The idea of getting close enough to a Wendigo to use a crossbow made my blood run cold, but I kept my mouth shut and finished fueling up. The next 3 hours took us deeper into country that most people never saw. The logging roads grew narrower and more rutted, forcing me to slow down to protect the truck's suspension. Very old stands of black spruce and balsam fir pressed close to both sides of the road, their branches occasionally scraping against the windows. Cell phone coverage disappeared completely, leaving us truly isolated from the outside world. "Perfect," Silas said, checking his GPS as we bounced through another pothole. No distractions, no interference, just us and the wilderness. We reached our destination just as the afternoon started to fade. A small lake surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a road that hadn't seen maintenance in at least 5 years. The clearing beside the water was barely large enough for our camp, with towering pines creating a natural barrier on 3 sides. Unloading the trailer took the better part of an hour. These men had brought enough equipment for a month-long expedition: military-grade tents, portable generators, a communications setup that looked like something from a spy movie. Most impressive was their arsenal. Besides their primary weapons, they'd packed enough ammunition to outfit a small army, along with various specialized rounds designed for different types of game. "Planning for every contingency," Marcus explained as he unpacked boxes of shells. "Never know what kind of stopping power you'll need until you're face to face with your target." I set up my own tent at the edge of the clearing, as far from their fancy camp as the space allowed. Years of guiding had taught me to keep some distance from clients, especially ones who made me uncomfortable. As I hammered in the last tent stake, I noticed how incredibly quiet the forest was. No bird calls could be heard through the trees. No squirrels chattered in the branches overhead. Even the usual buzz of insects was missing, replaced by a quiet so complete it felt wrong. In 30 years of working these woods, I'd never experienced anything like it. "You notice how quiet it is?" I asked Silas as he tested his satellite communication device. He paused and listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Peaceful. That's what we came here for." "It's not peaceful, it's wrong. There should be ravens at least, maybe some red squirrels. This time of year, the woods should be full of activity." Julian looked up from organizing his gear, that permanent grin stretching across his face. "Maybe they know something's coming." The way he said it made my skin crawl, but Silas and Marcus just laughed. "Animals have instincts," Marcus said. "They can sense predators in the area. Probably why this spot is perfect for what we're after." I wanted to argue that predators don't make things this quiet. Even with wolves and bears around, you'd still hear smaller animals. It felt like something had scared everything away. But these men had paid me to guide them, not give them nature lessons. I finished setting up my camp and tried to ignore the weird silence all around us. When it got dark, we gathered around their portable camp stove for dinner. The men were excited, talking about their plans for the morning and trading hunting stories. I mostly just ate and listened to them talk about killing animals while the strange quiet of the forest continued. Julian sat a bit away from everyone else, looking back and forth between the conversation and the trees. He kept smiling, but his eyes didn't stop moving, checking the shadows like he thought something might come out. Every few minutes he'd tilt his head like he was trying to hear something nobody else could. "Something wrong, Julian?" Silas asked, following his friend's stare into the woods. "Just eager to get started," Julian replied, his voice carrying that same unsettling cheerfulness. "I can feel it out there, watching us." Marcus checked his watch and yawned. "Well, whatever's out there will have to wait until morning. We need to be sharp for tomorrow." As the others got ready for bed, I sat by the dying fire and listened to the quiet forest around us. No owls called in the distance. No branches rustled with the movement of night animals. Even the lake was completely still. Julian was the last to go to his tent, but I noticed his shape moving around inside long after the others had gone to sleep. Occasionally I heard the sound of muffled laughter coming from his direction. Soft giggles that went on far longer than any joke could explain. I pulled my sleeping bag closer and tried not to think about what we might find when morning came. I packed up early in the morning while the others took down their camp. I put my Winchester .308 on my back. Something about today felt off. Silas put his GPS unit and satellite phone into a tough case and closed it quickly. Marcus put his hunting knife on his leg and checked his rifle. Julian stood at the edge of camp, looking into the trees with a weird smile on his face. "Ready to make history, Caleb?" Silas asked, hefting his massive rifle with practiced ease. I nodded and started toward the game trail I'd spotted the previous evening. The path was barely visible, just a narrow break in the brush that animals had worn down over decades of use. Deer trails usually, though sometimes bears or moose would follow the same routes through the thickest parts of the forest. We moved in single file through stands of black spruce and balsam fir that seemed to grow thicker with each step. The trees pressed close on both sides, their branches heavy with moisture from yesterday's fog. Every few steps I had to duck under low-hanging limbs or push through clusters of evergreen needles that caught at our clothes. The silence that had bothered me at camp grew worse as we moved deeper into the wilderness. The squirrels weren't chattering overhead. The ravens that normally followed hunting parties in hopes of scavenging scraps were completely absent. Even our footsteps seemed muffled. "Christ, it's quiet," Marcus muttered after we'd been walking for an hour. "Good for hunting," Silas replied, though his voice was lower than usual. "Animals can't hear us coming." Julian let out one of his disturbing giggles. "Maybe they already know we're here." I kept my mouth shut and stayed focused on the trail ahead. From all my years as a guide, I could tell something was off about this place. No animals anywhere, and the air felt thick, making it hard to breathe. The men kept checking their GPS units, marking spots and updating their maps like they were on some kind of mission. Marcus used his binoculars to look at the trees ahead, while Silas took pictures of anything unusual. Broken branches, disturbed ground, and even regular animal tracks crossing our path. "How much further do we go before we start seeing signs?" Silas asked as we paused to rest near a small creek. "Could be anywhere," I said, refilling my water bottle from the stream. "These things don't follow patterns that humans understand." "Everything follows patterns," Marcus said, adjusting his pack straps. "Just have to know how to read them." Julian crouched beside the water, still smiling as he watched the current flow around moss-covered rocks. His reflection looked distorted in the moving water, the grin appearing even wider than it actually was. We continued deeper into the forest as the morning went on, following the game trail through terrain that grew increasingly thick and hard to walk through. The trees overhead blocked most of the sky, making it seem like twilight even though the sun was climbing toward noon. Around noon, we found it. The tree stood slightly apart from the others, a massive black spruce with bark scarred by something that had raked claws down its trunk from top to bottom. The gouges were deep enough to reach the pale wood underneath, and they ran nearly 8 feet from the highest marks to where they ended just above shoulder height. Marcus approached the tree with obvious excitement, running his fingers along the damaged bark. "Look at the spacing between the marks. Whatever made these had claws at least 6 inches long." Silas walked around the tree with his camera, taking pictures of the scratches from every angle while checking the display screen after each shot. The electronic beeping of his camera seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "This is fresh," Marcus said, examining wood chips scattered around the base of the tree. "Maybe a week old, 2 at most." Julian stood about 10 feet away from the rest of us, his head tilted like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. His smile had stretched even wider if that was possible, pulling the corners of his mouth up in a way that looked almost painful. I studied the claw marks and remembered my grandmother's warnings. She described trees like this, scarred by creatures that marked their territory the way bears did, but higher and deeper than any bear could reach. Wendigo signs, she'd called them, warnings to stay away. "We should head back," I said, shouldering my rifle and taking a step toward the trail we'd followed. "This isn't something you want to mess with." All 3 men laughed. "Are you kidding?" Silas lowered his camera and looked at me like I'd suggested abandoning a gold mine. "This is exactly what we came here for, first real evidence, and you want to run. It's not running. It's being smart about something that's killed people for generations." Marcus pulled out his GPS unit and marked the coordinates of the tree. "Caleb, mate, this is why we hired you. To get us close to our quarry." "Well, we're close now." Julian's giggle rose in pitch as he stared at the scarred trunk. His fingers twitched at his sides like he wanted to touch the claw marks, but couldn't quite bring himself to make contact. "We keep going," Silas said, checking his rifle's action with practiced movements. "We follow this trail until we find more signs, then we set up a hunting blind and wait." The afternoon got dark early. Even though sunset wasn't for hours, the temperature was the same, but the darkness made the forest feel colder, more isolated, more dangerous. I checked the scratched tree one last time before I went after the others into the woods. We were walking towards something none of us were ready for. I picked up my pace as we continued deeper along the game trail, putting distance between us and that scarred tree. The men followed behind me, still chattering about the claw marks and snapping photos of anything that looked remotely unusual. Every few minutes one of them would stop to examine broken branches or disturbed ground, treating this like some kind of academic expedition instead of what it really was. The trail curved through increasingly thick forest before opening into a small clearing beside a marshy area that stretched maybe 50 yards across. Cattails and sedge grass grew thick around the edges of the standing water, creating the kind of place where animals came to drink and feed. Perfect for finding tracks, which meant perfect for making camp if these men insisted on continuing their hunt. "This will work," I said, dropping my pack near a cluster of birch trees at the clearing's edge. "Good sight lines, water access, and soft ground if anything's been through here recently." Silas immediately began unpacking his equipment while Marcus pulled out his binoculars to look around the area. Julian stood at the clearing center, turning slowly in place like he was taking inventory of the entire space. His smile looked wider than usual, if that was even possible. "Excellent choice, Caleb," Silas said, setting up his satellite communication device on a flat rock. "This spot has tactical advantages: open field of fire, multiple escape routes, natural barriers on 3 sides. I watched him set up his gear with military precision and wondered again what these guys really did for work back home. Their equipment was too expensive, and they knew too much about tactics to be weekend hunters, even rich ones. Marcus walked around the edge of the clearing, checking the soft ground near the water with the focus of someone who knew how to track. He moved carefully, stopping every few feet to look at the mud and plants more closely. "Caleb, come have a look at this," he called from the far side of the marsh. I crossed the clearing and found him kneeling beside what was clearly a track pushed into the soft earth near the water. The print was huge, nearly 18 inches long and shaped like a human foot, but stretched and weird-looking. The toes were long, each ending in what looked like a claw mark dug into the mud. "Jesus," I whispered, crouching beside him for a better look. Marcus used his finger to trace the outline of the print without actually touching it. "Look at the depth. Whatever made this had to weigh at least 400 pounds, maybe more. And see these marks at the toe ends. Those aren't from claws dragging. Those are puncture marks from claws digging in for traction." More tracks led away from the water's edge, each one sunk deep into the marshy ground. I looked where the tracks were going and felt my stomach drop. The prints headed directly toward a spot where someone, or something, had made a rough shelter from broken branches and moss. "Found something else," Julian's voice carried across the clearing, pitched higher than usual with excitement. He stood near the makeshift shelter, poking through what looked like a collection of white objects scattered in the grass. As we got closer, we could see they were bones of various sizes. Some from deer and moose, others from smaller animals I couldn't identify. Most had been cracked open, probably for marrow, and many had the kind of bite marks you'd expect from a large predator. Julian reached down and picked up a human bone. I felt terrified when I saw it. The bone was clearly human and had teeth marks on it that didn't match any animal I knew. His smile got super wide as he held up the bone, pulling the corners of his mouth up in a way that looked almost painful. Then he started to giggle, a sound that got higher and higher until it became nearly hysterical laughter. "Look at this," he managed between fits of giggling. "Look at these marks. Something's been gnawing on people out here." I crossed the distance between us in 3 quick steps and grabbed the femur away from him. The bone felt heavier than it should have, and touching it made my skin crawl with an instinctive revulsion that went deeper than just seeing human remains. "We're leaving," I said, looking between the 3 men. "Right now. Pack up your gear and we're heading back to the truck." All 3 of them stared at me like I'd suggested abandoning a fortune in gold. "Are you insane?" Silas lowered his camera and stepped closer. "This is exactly what we came here for, physical evidence, proof that our quarry exists. This isn't proof, this is a warning. Whatever's out here killed people and left their bones around like decorations. That's not something you hunt, that's something you run from." Marcus shook his head and pulled out his GPS unit. "Caleb, mate, we've paid you a considerable sum to guide us to our target. This is the closest we've ever come to actual contact. I don't care about your money. I care about getting out of here alive." Julian's giggling had subsided to occasional bursts, but his grin remained fixed in that painful-looking stretch. He kept staring at the bone in my hands like he wanted to snatch it back. Silas began unpacking what looked like small electronic devices from a hard-sided case. Trail cameras, I realized, motion-activated units designed to capture images of whatever passed through the area. "We're staying," he said with the kind of finality that suggested the discussion was over. "We'll set up a perimeter of cameras around the camp and wait to see what shows up." "You don't understand what you're dealing with," I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. These men had traveled thousands of miles and spent serious money to get to this point. They weren't going to be convinced by warnings from a local guide. I watched Silas put the cameras at good spots around the clearing, each one hidden and aimed to catch different ways into our camp. The devices beeped softly as he tested their motion sensors and night vision. The sun was starting to set. The quiet that had followed us all day seemed to get worse as darkness came closer. Julian helped Silas with the cameras, though his help was all over the place and broken up by sudden bursts of that disturbing laughter. Every few minutes he would stop what he was doing and stare at the bone pile or the footprints near the water's edge, his smile getting even wider. As full darkness settled over the clearing, Julian's behavior became increasingly strange. He would burst into fits of laughter for no apparent reason, the sound traveling across the water and into the surrounding trees. Between the outbursts, he muttered to himself in what sounded like a language I'd never heard before. Harsh, rough sounds that seemed to catch in his throat. I set up my tent as far from the others as the clearing allowed and tried to ignore the way Julian kept staring at the human bone I'd taken from him. His eyes followed it whenever I moved, and occasionally he would giggle and nod like he was agreeing with something only he could hear. Silas activated his satellite phone and made a brief call to someone back home, reporting their location and the discovery of tracks. Marcus took care of his weapons and checked his gear carefully, but I noticed him looking toward the tree line more frequently as the night got darker. Even his confidence seemed to be fading in the complete silence surrounding our camp. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the night, or rather, the complete absence of them. No owls called in the distance. No branches rustled with the movement of small animals. Even the usual chirping of insects was missing, replaced by a quiet so total it felt unnatural. Julian's occasional outbursts broke the silence like gunshots. His laughter would start suddenly, rise to an almost hysterical pitch, then cut off just as abruptly. In between, I could hear him muttering those strange words, the harsh sounds reaching across the clearing. Sleep felt impossible. Every time I started to drift off, another burst of Julian's laughter would jerk me back awake. Worse was the way the silence felt around us. I clutched the human bone in my hands and wondered what we had walked into. The scratched tree had been a warning. The tracks and bones were confirmation. We were in the territory of something that killed without mercy and left human remains scattered around. But the men I was guiding saw only an opportunity to add another prize to their collections, another story to tell at dinner parties back home. They had no idea that some things weren't meant to be hunted. Julian's laughter rang out across the marsh again, longer and more unhinged than before, and I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around myself while staring up at the star-filled sky visible through the gap in the tree cover above our camp. Julian's laughter kept going most of the night, breaking the weird quiet with bursts of sound that made my skin crawl. I lay in my sleeping bag with that yellowed femur, looking up at the stars through the gap in the trees, knowing I wouldn't be able to sleep. The temperature had dropped during the night, but not enough to explain the intense cold that seemed to get through my sleeping bag. Marcus had stopped moving around in his tent hours ago, and I could hear Silas occasionally changing position, probably just as unable to sleep as I was. But Julian kept muttering those harsh, rough sounds between his outbursts, the words carrying across the clearing like he was talking to the night. I must have dozed off sometime after 3 o'clock in the morning because the beeping from Silas's phone woke me up. The sky was gray, like it always is right before sunrise when everything still looks dim. "Motion alert," Silas called out, his voice cutting through the pre-dawn quiet. "Camera 3. I heard him unzipping his tent, then the sound of boots on wet grass as he moved toward his equipment. Marcus emerged from his tent a few seconds later, rifle already in hand, looking around the tree line like someone who knew dangerous places. Julian's tent rustled, followed by that weird giggle. His laughter had changed over the night, becoming sharper and more frequent, breaking out in sudden bursts. I rolled out of my sleeping bag and grabbed my Winchester, quickly checking it. After watching these men dismiss every warning and ignore every sign we'd encountered, I wasn't sure what good it would do against something that had been killing people in these woods for generations. Silas crouched beside his satellite communication setup, scrolling through images on his phone screen. His face was blue from the phone light, and I could see the excitement in his expression even from across the clearing. "Got it," he said, holding up the phone. Camera captured one frame before the unit went offline. Marcus crossed the clearing in quick strides, his boots squelching in the soft ground near the marsh. Julian followed, but his movement was erratic, like he was having trouble coordinating his legs. The giggling came in short bursts as he walked, and I noticed his hands were shaking. I joined them around Silas's phone, dreading what I was about to see, but unable to look away. The image on the screen made my grandmother's warnings feel like gentle suggestions compared to the reality staring back at us. The creature in the photo stood between two pine trees at the edge of the clearing, caught in the infrared flash of the trail camera. It was impossibly tall and thin, like someone had stretched a human body until it barely held together. The face was nothing but a skull with hollow eye sockets, but those sockets held points of sickly yellow light that seemed to burn even through the digital image. "Beautiful," Julian whispered, his voice pitched higher than usual. The giggling started again, but this time it didn't stop. It kept going, rising in pitch and volume until it sounded like he was choking on his own laughter. Silas made the image bigger, looking closely at details that made the creature look even more wrong. The arms were too long, hanging down past where knees should be. The skin looked gray and patchy, pulled tight over bones that stuck out at weird angles. "Cameras destroyed," Marcus said, checking his GPS unit. Whatever did this knew exactly where the device was hidden. Julian doubled over with laughter, the sound echoing across the water and into the trees. When he straightened up, his face was flushed and his eyes were too bright, like he was running a fever. "Hunger," he said, the word coming out between fits of giggling. "Endless winter, always hungry, never enough meat." The words spilled out of him quickly, mixed with that harsh language he'd been muttering all night. I couldn't understand most of what he was saying, but the tone was wrong. Not like someone speaking words, but like someone repeating things they'd heard whispered in the dark. Silas put down his phone and grabbed his rifle, checking the magazine and working the bolt like he'd done it 1,000 times before. The mechanical sound seemed way too loud in the quiet morning. "This is it," he said. "This is what we came for." I wanted to argue, to grab these men and drag them back to the truck. But Julian's behavior was getting worse by the minute. His laughter had reached a fever pitch, coming in waves that made him stumble as he tried to walk. The words pouring out of him were coming faster now, overlapping with the giggling until it was hard to tell where one sound ended and the other began. I checked my rifle again, making sure the safety was off and a round was chambered. My grandmother's stories had prepared me for the existence of the Wendigo, but not for what it would feel like to actually encounter one. The smell hit us first. It was overwhelming, making my eyes water and my stomach clench. Rotting meat was the strongest part, but underneath that was something like wet dog mixed with the sweet stench of decay. The kind of smell that gets into your nose and throat and won't leave, making every breath taste like death. Julian's laughter got impossibly loud, bouncing off the water and seeming to come from multiple directions at once. He spun in place, his arms outstretched like he was embracing the morning air. The words spilling out of him in that harsh language that hurt to listen to. The Wendigo came out from the trees. It stood nearly 9 feet tall, exactly like the creature in the trail camera photo, but somehow worse in person. The gray, mottled skin looked diseased, stretched tight over a skeletal frame that seemed too fragile to support its own weight. Its face looked like a skull with hollow eye sockets that had points of sickly yellow light, and its mouth hung open to reveal rows of yellowed teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points. The creature's arms were impossibly long, hanging down past its knees, ending in hands that were more like claws. Its legs bent at wrong angles, as if the joints had been rearranged by someone who didn't understand how bodies were supposed to work. Silas raised his rifle and fired 3 rapid shots. I watched the muzzle flashes as the brass casings arced through the air and landed in the wet grass. The bullets struck the Wendigo center mass, right where the heart should be, but they passed through without any visible effect. No blood, no impact, no reaction at all. Julian immediately charged toward the creature, still laughing hysterically, his arms pumping as he ran across the uneven ground of the clearing. The creature moved with impossible speed, covering the distance to Julian in 2 long strides that didn't look like normal movement. It appeared beside him suddenly. Its clawed hands wrapped around Julian's torso and lifted him off the ground. His hysterical laughter turned to screams. The Wendigo's claws opened Julian's chest like someone unzipping a jacket. The sound was wet and precise, nothing like the dramatic tearing you'd expect from a wild animal attack. Blood shot out from the wounds in a spray that reached the cattails at the marsh's edge, covering the morning grass in dark streaks that looked black in the gray dawn light. Julian's screams cut off so abruptly that the silence afterward felt like a physical blow. His body hit the muddy ground in pieces, arms separated from torso, legs twisted at impossible angles. But his face remained intact. That horrible grin still stretched across his face, even as his eyes went blank and lifeless. I stood there like my boots had grown roots. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The smell of blood mixed with that rotting stench coming off the creature, creating a combination that made my throat close up and my eyes water. Silas kept firing his rifle, cracks across the clearing in rapid succession. Brass casings flew from the ejection port as he worked the bolt, backing toward the edge of the forest while cursing in a steady stream of words that would have made a sailor proud. "Marcus, Marcus, get behind it," Silas shouted between shots, his voice pitched higher than I'd ever heard it. "Circle around." Marcus had already pulled out his big hunting knife from his belt as he moved through the tall grass near the water's edge. He crouched low and moved in a wide circle, trying to get behind the Wendigo. But the creature moved weirdly fast. One moment it stood over what was left of Julian. The next it was right behind Marcus, without seeming to move between those spots. No running, nothing I could track. It just appeared there and made my eyes hurt trying to follow it. Marcus spun around and stabbed his knife forward. The blade should have gone right through the Wendigo's back and out its chest, but instead, it passed through the creature's gray, spotty skin without doing any damage. The Wendigo's claws cut across Marcus's back, slicing open his jacket and skin. Blood soaked through his torn clothes as he fell forward, landing face first in the mud at the edge of the marsh. I wanted to move, wanted to run or shoot or do something useful, but my legs wouldn't work. Every instinct told me to help, but another part of my brain, the part that had listened to my grandmother's warnings, knew that getting involved would just get me killed too. The Wendigo killed Marcus quickly and carefully. It grabbed his head in both clawed hands and twisted, making a cracking sound. Marcus's body went limp right away, his neck broken. Silas's rifle clicked empty. The sound carried across the clearing. His hands shook as he struggled to get a new magazine from his vest, dropping the empty one into the wet grass. The Wendigo turned toward him, moving almost playfully. It walked slowly across the clearing, taking its time while Silas tried to reload. The yellow lights in its empty eye sockets seemed to get brighter as it got closer. Silas got the new magazine in and reloaded. He lifted the rifle and fired 5 quick shots that should have killed any normal creature, but the bullets went right through the Wendigo without doing anything. Just like before, the creature just stood there while Silas shot at it, the bullets passing through its gray body without effect. When the rifle clicked empty again, it suddenly rushed at Silas, covering the distance instantly. Silas tried to run. His boots slipped in the mud as he turned and sprinted toward the trees, dropping his rifle and running as fast as he could. He only made it about 20 feet before the Wendigo's claws caught his back. I heard his spine break with a wet cracking sound that was worse than what happened to Marcus. Silas fell forward and slid through the wet grass, his legs not working anymore. His arms still moved for a few seconds, trying to pull himself forward before they stopped working too. The Wendigo stood over Silas and looked right at me. Those yellow lights in its skull stared at my face with a weird intelligence that seemed human but wrong. It wasn't looking at me like a hungry animal. It was watching me like it knew exactly what it was doing. All 3 men were dead. Julian ripped apart, Marcus's neck broken, and Silas dying slowly with a broken back that left him conscious but unable to move. Their equipment was scattered around the clearing, rifles, gear, phones, and GPS units. None of it helped against something that didn't follow normal rules. I stood there with my Winchester, knowing it wouldn't help any more than throwing rocks would. The Wendigo had already shown me bullets did nothing to it. The creature my grandmother had warned me about, the thing from the deep woods that ate people, had just shown me why the old stories said you couldn't stop it. Silas was breathing less and less. His eyes moved back and forth, the only parts of him still working, watching the Wendigo as it walked around the clearing, looking at what it had done. The creature seemed pleased with all the death. I realized I was next. I waited for the claws to find my chest, for those impossible hands to tear me apart like they had Julian. My rifle hung useless at my side while I stared into those hollow eye sockets, watching the yellow light blink in the darkness. The Wendigo moved toward me slowly, just like it had when going after Silas. It made no sound as it moved through the wet grass, and I could see now that its feet weren't quite touching the ground. It floated instead of walked, coming closer like it knew it had plenty of time to reach me. When it stopped, we were so close I could have reached out and touched its gray, spotty skin. Close enough to see that what I'd thought was flesh actually moved and changed like something not solid. The smell coming from it made my eyes water and my throat close up. Rotting meat was the strongest smell, but under that was something chemical and sharp. Those hollow sockets looked right at my face. The yellow lights blinked and pulsed, and I realized they weren't eyes at all, but something different. They were just spots of hunger that could somehow see. When it spoke, the voice seemed to come from all around me. The words didn't just enter through my ears. They went straight into my head, making me feel small and scared. Tell them not to come back. The breath that came with those words made me gag. It smelled like rotten meat and death. But under that was something else, a cold from places where the sun never shines and nothing grows. The Wendigo looked at me with those blinking lights for eyes, and I felt like it was sizing me up for something. I couldn't tell if we'd been standing there for seconds or hours. My legs went numb, but I couldn't move or look away. Then it was gone, not running or walking, just gone like someone had erased it between one breath and the next. The heavy feeling in the air lifted, leaving only morning quiet and the smell of blood soaking into the ground. I stood there, frozen, rifle still up, staring at the empty space. My brain couldn't process what happened. The creature had let me live. It had talked to me. My legs gave out and I fell hard in the wet grass next to Julian's remains. His torn jacket was soaked with blood that looked black in the early light, and that horrible grin was still on his face. His eyes stared at nothing, empty like a dead fish's. I made myself look away to check on the others. Silas was still breathing, but barely. His eyes followed me when I knelt beside him, and I could see the question. He wanted to know if I could help him. There wasn't any help to give. I'd seen enough hunting accidents to know that whatever the Wendigo did to his neck had severed something important. Silas might last a few more minutes or hours, but he wasn't walking out of these woods. I couldn't stay and watch him die. My hands shook as I grabbed my backpack from near the birch trees. The GPS on my belt was now my most important possession. Without it, I'd be lost in these woods until I ended up like the three Americans. Everything else could stay. Their expensive rifles, their gear, their satellite phones and cameras. None of it helped when it mattered. I stuffed my sleeping bag into the pack and checked that I still had water and trail mix, then started walking toward the path we'd followed to reach this clearing. The forest felt different now. The heavy quiet was still there, but under it was something else, like I was being watched as I moved through the trees. Not exactly threatening, but aware, like the Wendigo was making sure I actually left. I walked too fast through terrain that needed careful steps. Branches caught my jacket and roots made me trip, but I kept going without slowing. The path that seemed so clear on our way in now seemed to change, with new paths appearing that I didn't remember seeing before. The GPS became essential. I checked it every few minutes, making sure I was heading toward our base camp. The little arrow on the screen pointing toward safety kept me from panicking completely. Hours went by in a blur of black spruce and wet bushes. I stopped only when I had to rest, falling against tree trunks and drinking water while my legs shook. During one break, I realized I'd been moving most of the day and had only covered half the distance back to camp. The journey that took us several hours with stops to check signs and set up gear had turned into a brutal hike that pushed me too hard. I wasn't young anymore, and carrying a full pack through dense forest while dealing with shock had me stumbling badly. Night came while I was still hours from the truck. I used my headlamp just enough to avoid walking into trees or stepping in holes. Every sound made me stop and listen for footsteps that were too quiet, for breathing from something too big. But the Wendigo had said what it wanted to say and didn't seem interested in saying more. The forest stayed quiet, except for my own clumsy steps through the bushes. I reached our base camp as the sun was setting the next day, almost 18 hours after running from the clearing where 3 men had died. The truck sat exactly where we'd left it, looking beautiful. Chrome bumpers and solid steel, with heated seats and a radio that played normal music. My hands shook so badly I couldn't get the key in the ignition until my 4th try. When the engine started, the sound was so normal and safe that I almost lost it right there in the driver's seat. The drive back to Thunder Bay happened in chunks, broken up by gas station stops where I bought coffee I couldn't taste and sandwiches I couldn't eat. I sat in truck stop parking lots, looking at myself in the mirrors, seeing a man who looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 days. At a station outside Marathon, I tried calling the Ontario Provincial Police on my cell phone. The call went to voicemail because I couldn't figure out what to say. How do you explain that 3 American hunters were dead because they found exactly what they were looking for? How do you tell a police dispatcher that bullets don't work on stories that should have stayed in old legends? I hung up and bought another cup of coffee I wouldn't drink, then got back in the truck and kept driving toward a conversation I wasn't ready to have with people who would never believe what I'd seen. The highway went on through forests that looked normal and safe in my headlights, but I knew better now. Somewhere back in those trees, a thing made of endless hunger was waiting for the next group of men who thought they could hunt the impossible. And I was the only one left to tell them not to come back. I parked outside the Thunder Bay OPP detachment at 3 o'clock in the morning and sat in the truck for 20 minutes trying to figure out how to start. The building's brick front looked solid and bureaucratic under the parking lot lights. The kind of place where people dealt with drunk drivers and domestic disputes, not creatures that shouldn't exist. My hands still shook when I reached for the door handle. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Julian's chest opening like a zipper and heard that wet sound of Marcus's neck snapping. The smell of rotting meat clung to my clothes, even though I'd stopped twice to change shirts at gas stations. The desk sergeant looked up when I walked through the glass doors, taking in my mud-stained jacket and hollow expression with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of people stumble in after bad nights. I must have looked like a drunk or someone coming off a 3-day bender. "Can I help you?" "I need to report deaths. 3 men, Americans." The words came out flat and mechanical, like I was reading from a script. I was their guide. The sergeant's expression shifted from bored to alert. He picked up a pen and pulled out an incident report form, gesturing for me to sit in the plastic chair beside his desk. Names: Silas Thorne, Julian Croft, Marcus Blackwood. I spelled each one while he wrote them down in careful block letters. "They're dead. Killed by—" I stopped, knowing how the next words would sound. "Killed by what?" "An animal attack. Something in the woods north of Superior." The questions came in a steady stream. When did this happen? Where exactly? What kind of animal? Did I see the attack? How did I escape? Why didn't I bring the bodies back? I answered everything as honestly as I could without mentioning the Wendigo by name. Large predator, unprecedented size, moved too fast to identify clearly, tore the men apart before I could react. I ran when I had the chance and hiked out through the night. The sergeant called in a detective named Morrison. He looked tired, like someone woke him up. Morrison asked all the same questions again, writing down my answers in a notebook while watching my face for signs I might be lying. "You said you were their guide. What were they hunting?" I'd gotten ready for this question during the drive back, but my practiced answer still sounded weak when I said it. They were tracking unusual animal signs, research purposes. They had cameras and GPS equipment. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "Research? What kind of researchers carry hunting rifles?" They wanted to be prepared, said they were documenting large predator behavior in remote areas. "And you believe that?" I met his stare and nodded. Morrison wrote something else in his notebook, probably a note about how my story was falling apart under basic questioning. They kept me in that interview room for 6 hours, going over the same details repeatedly, while different officers took turns asking variations of the same questions. Where exactly had we camped? What were the GPS coordinates? Could I draw a map? Did the men have any enemies? Had there been arguments, money disputes? By the time they released me, I understood that Morrison and his colleagues thought I'd either killed the 3 Americans myself or led them into danger through criminal negligence. The sympathetic tone in their voices was the kind reserved for people who were clearly disturbed, but hadn't quite crossed the line into being charged with anything. "We'll send a search and rescue team to the coordinates you provided," Morrison said as he walked me to the exit. "If we find anything, we'll be in touch." The search team went out 2 days later, with helicopters and tracking dogs. I watched the local news coverage from my cabin, seeing footage of the remote lake where we'd made base camp and interviews with the team leader explaining how they were searching the surrounding forest. They found our abandoned base camp, exactly where I'd said it would be. The expensive tents were still standing, and the men's stuff was still scattered around the clearing. Sleeping bags, cooking equipment, and electronic devices worth thousands of dollars that no criminal would have left behind. But they found no bodies, not at the coordinates I'd given for the marshy clearing, not anywhere within a 10-mile radius of our camp. The bone pile I'd described was gone. The huge footprints in the mud were gone. Even the claw marks on the black spruce had disappeared, leaving bark that looked like it had never been touched. Morrison called me back for another interview after the search ended. This time his questions were about my mental state and whether I'd been using drugs or alcohol during the trip. Had I been seeing things, having memory problems, losing track of time? "Look, Caleb," he said after an hour of carefully worded inquiries about my psychological health. "We found blood evidence at a location roughly matching your description, dark stains on vegetation that could be human. But without bodies or witnesses, all we can do is classify this as a missing persons case." "What about the families?" Morrison's expression got serious. "The families are asking questions we can't answer. 3 wealthy men with no history of mental illness or suicidal behavior disappear in the Canadian wilderness with only you as a witness. You say they were killed by some kind of unknown animal, but we can't find any sign of them or this creature." I sat in the plastic chair looking at my hands while Morrison explained that the case would remain open but inactive. The 3 Americans were officially missing, not dead. I was listed as the only witness to an unknown animal attack that couldn't be verified or proven. The families hired private investigators within a week. Men in expensive suits asked different questions. They were paid to find someone to blame, so they were extra aggressive. They looked into my background, my money situation, my history as a guide. They talked to former clients and checked my business records, looking for signs of carelessness or criminal behavior. They found my gambling debts, my failing business, and the fact that I'd been desperate enough for money to take 3 strangers into dangerous territory without proper backup plans. The investigation report painted me as an unstable guide who'd probably panicked during a real animal attack, leaving his clients to save himself. The report suggested I made up details about the deaths to cover up my cowardice, and recommended that the families sue me for wrongful death due to carelessness. The Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources took away my guiding license until the police investigation finished. Without the license, I couldn't legally take clients into the wilderness, which meant my business died overnight. Insurance companies refused to pay death benefits without bodies or clear evidence of death. The families were stuck in legal uncertainty, unable to collect life insurance or settle estates while their relatives remained officially missing rather than deceased. I sold my truck and most of my equipment to pay legal fees for a lawyer who couldn't do much except explain why the system was designed to protect guides from silly lawsuits, but not from cases where 3 people disappeared without explanation. The cabin I'd been renting became too expensive without income from guiding. I moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in Thunder Bay's East End, a place with thin walls and neighbors who played music too loud and fought about money. The hardware store on Cumberland Street hired me part-time to work the back warehouse, loading trucks and organizing inventory. The job paid minimum wage and required no interaction with customers, which was perfect for me right then. I couldn't handle conversations about outdoor recreation or hunting equipment without my hands starting to shake. I couldn't sleep well anymore. Every night brought the same images: Julian's chest opening, Marcus's neck twisting, Sela's lying paralyzed in the wet grass. The sounds were worse than the pictures. That wet tearing noise when the claws found flesh. The crack of breaking vertebrae. Julian's crazy laughter mixing with words in a language that human throats weren't made to speak. I tried sleeping pills from the drugstore, but they only delayed the nightmares until morning. I'd wake up on my couch at noon, confused and covered in sweat, having dreamed about hollow eye sockets filled with yellow light that watched me from the foot of my bed. 6 months passed before I stopped checking the local news for stories about missing hikers or unexplained deaths in the wilderness north of Thunder Bay. Part of me hoped some other guide would run into the Wendigo and survive to back up my story. A larger part hoped no one else would be stupid enough to go looking for legends that were better left alone. I worked my shifts at the hardware store, stocking shelves with tools and supplies that reminded me of everything I'd lost. Compass displays made my stomach tight. Trail maps brought back memories of 3 men studying GPS coordinates. They were so sure technology could solve any problem. Customers occasionally asked if I knew anything about wilderness guiding or remote camping spots. I learned to quickly change those conversations, suggesting they talk to other outfitters or check with the tourism office for recommendations. Morrison stopped by the store one afternoon in late autumn, pretending to buy screws for a home repair project, but really to check on how I was doing. He asked casual questions about how I was adjusting to civilian life, whether I'd been having any more episodes or memory problems. "Case is still open," he said while I rang up his purchase. "Sometimes bodies turn up years later, especially in that kind of terrain. Animals scatter remains. Weather does its thing, you never know." I handed him his receipt and nodded, but we both knew those bodies would never be found. Whatever the Wendigo had done with the remains, it had erased them more completely than any natural process could account for. That night I dreamed about hollow sockets filled with blinking yellow light. In the dream, the Wendigo stood at the foot of my bed, speaking in a dry, rustling voice, reminding me of the message I was supposed to deliver. "Tell them not to come back." I woke up knowing that somewhere in those woods the creature was still waiting for the next group of hunters who thought they could kill death itself. And my warning, even if anyone believed it, would never be enough to stop them. What was the most chilling detail in this story for you? Follow for more tailies from the edge of the wild.